The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor of the country club ballroom, its crystal fragments scattering like my dignity across Italian tiles that reflected the horrified faces of 200 wedding guests. My sister Rachel stood above me in her $1,000 Vera Wang gown, her laughter ringing through the sudden silence as I knelt among the shards, my bridesmaid dress soaked with wine and shame. "Oh, Chloe," she said, her voice carrying the practiced sweetness that had fooled everyone but me for 28 years. "You're always so clumsy. Maybe if you spent less time with your nose in medical books and more time learning basic coordination, you wouldn't embarrass yourself at important events." The laughter that followed her words was scattered but devastating. Nervous chuckles from guests who didn't know how to react to such casual cruelty. Genuine amusement from family members who'd watched this dynamic play out for decades. But what cut deepest was the silence from people who should have defended me. Our parents, who studied their dinner plates as if the wedding menu contained secrets worth dying for. Our cousins, who suddenly found the floral arrangements fascinating. Even Rachel's new husband, Marcus, who looked uncomfortable but said nothing. I tried to rise gracefully from the floor, my hands trembling as I gathered the larger pieces of glass while pretending the tears streaming down my cheeks were from embarrassment rather than heartbreak. The accident hadn't been accidental. Rachel had deliberately bumped into me while I was reaching for my water glass, then spun the narrative to make my clumsiness the story rather than her orchestrated cruelty. "Let me help you, sweetie," said our Aunt Margaret, the only person who moved to assist me. Her voice carried the kind of forced brightness that adults use when trying to minimize children's pain, but I caught the flash of anger in her eyes as she glanced at Rachel. "No need," Rachel chirped, already turning back to her adoring guests. "Chloe's used to cleaning up her own messes. Aren't you, sister dear?" The dismissal was surgical in its precision, acknowledging our relationship while simultaneously severing any obligation for sisterly care or concern. Rachel had perfected this technique over decades of sibling torture, maintaining plausible deniability while inflicting maximum psychological damage. I spent the remainder of the reception in the bathroom, attempting to salvage my appearance while wedding guests streamed in and out, their conversations carefully avoiding any mention of the scene they'd witnessed. When women did speak to me, their voices carried the particular kindness reserved for victims of public humiliation, gentle, pitying, and ultimately useless for addressing the deeper wound. The drive home was silent, except for the sound of my parents discussing flower arrangements and catering choices, as if critiquing Rachel's wedding details could erase their complicity in allowing her to destroy me in front of everyone we knew. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady despite the storm raging in my chest. "I won't be attending family events where Rachel is present," I announced, watching my mother's face in the rearview mirror. "I'm done being her entertainment." "Chloe, honey," Mom replied, her tone carrying the weary patience of someone managing a chronic family dysfunction. "Rachel was just nervous about her big day. You know how wedding stress affects people. She didn't mean anything by it, but I knew better." Rachel had meant everything by it. The timing, the audience, the specific words chosen to inflict maximum damage, while maintaining her image as the beloved daughter who could do no wrong. The wedding humiliation wasn't an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of psychological warfare that had finally crossed a line I couldn't ignore. 12 years would pass before I saw Rachel again. 12 years during which I would build a successful career as a pediatric surgeon, heal from the trauma of our toxic relationship, and learn to define family as people who chose to love, rather than those who happened to share DNA. When she finally appeared at my door yesterday, tears streaming down her face, desperation replacing her usual composure, the woman who'd once laughed at my pain was begging for mercy from the sister she'd spent our childhood systematically destroying. But the story she told me about her daughter Sophie's illness would reveal secrets that made our wedding confrontation seem like a gentle disagreement, compared to the devastating truth that was about to emerge. Growing up in the Morrison household was like living in a solar system where Rachel was the sun, and I was a distant, forgotten planet struggling to receive enough light to survive. From our earliest memories, the favoritism was so blatant that extended family members would comment on it during holidays, their uncomfortable observations dismissed by our parents as misunderstanding the natural dynamics between two very different daughters. Rachel was everything our parents had dreamed of in a child. Beautiful, charming, naturally gifted at everything she attempted. She walked at 10 months, spoke in full sentences by 18 months, and was reading chapter books before kindergarten. Teachers adored her, neighbors praised her, and our parents basked in the reflected glory of producing such an exceptional human being. I, meanwhile, was the afterthought who'd arrived 3 years later when our parents thought they were done with child rearing. I was a difficult baby who cried frequently, a shy toddler who hid behind furniture during social gatherings, and a studious child whose academic achievements seemed mundane compared to Rachel's effortless excellence in everything from piano recitals to soccer tournaments. "Rachel has such natural charisma," Mom would tell her bridge club friends while I sat quietly in the corner with a book. "She could charm anyone into anything." Chloe's more internal, very serious, very focused on her studies. The word internal was code for socially awkward. Just as serious meant boring and focused on studies, suggested I had no other redeeming qualities worth mentioning. By age 8, I'd learned to translate our mother's descriptions of me as polite ways of acknowledging disappointment in my failure to match Rachel's magnetic personality. Rachel, meanwhile, seemed to understand instinctively that her position as the favored child required maintenance through contrast with my obvious inadequacies. She developed sophisticated methods for highlighting my flaws while appearing supportive, creating situations where my limitations became entertainment for family gatherings. "Poor Chloe," she would say with practiced sympathy when I struggled with social situations. "She's just not comfortable around people. Some children are naturally outgoing and others need more help." The pause before help was perfectly timed to suggest that my social difficulties were both pathetic and potentially permanent. School intensified the contrast between us. Rachel was elected class president, starred in every school play, and maintained perfect grades while participating in multiple extracurricular activities. I struggled with learning disabilities that weren't diagnosed until middle school, requiring tutoring and accommodations that our parents treated as embarrassing necessities rather than appropriate support for my educational needs. "We're spending so much on Chloe's tutoring," I overheard Dad telling Mom one evening when they thought I was asleep. "Maybe we should consider that not every child is meant for academic success. Some people are just average." The word average became my scarlet letter, a designation that explained why I received less attention, fewer opportunities, and lower expectations than my golden sister. But it also motivated me to prove that average could become extraordinary through determination and hard work. By high school, our roles were firmly established. Rachel was the daughter who brought pride to the family name, while I was the daughter who required constant management and damage control. When Rachel was accepted to prestigious universities with scholarship offers, my acceptance to state school was treated as a relief rather than an achievement. "At least Chloe found somewhere that will take her," Mom said when reviewing our college acceptances. We were worried she might not qualify for any decent programs, but medical school changed everything for me. The analytical thinking that had made me seem slow in traditional academic settings was perfectly suited for medical training. I discovered that my supposed social awkwardness was actually careful observation of human behavior, and my academic struggles had taught me persistence that served me well during the brutal demands of surgical training. Rachel, meanwhile, coasted through her communications degree at a prestigious university, relying on charm and family connections to secure internships and entry-level positions that led to a comfortable but unremarkable career in public relations. The reversal of our childhood dynamic became apparent during our 20s, when my medical residency was clearly more challenging and meaningful than Rachel's social media management for lifestyle brands. But rather than celebrating my success, our family seemed uncomfortable with my emergence as the accomplished daughter. "Chloe's become so serious," Rachel would say during family dinners, her tone suggesting that my dedication to saving children's lives was somehow a character flaw. "All work and no play. I worry that she's missing out on the fun parts of life." The criticism was delivered with sisterly concern, but it carried the implication that my career success was compensation for social failures rather than evidence of genuine achievement. Rachel couldn't acknowledge my accomplishments without diminishing them, just as our parents couldn't celebrate my success without comparing it unfavorably to her more traditional milestones. By the time of Rachel's wedding, our relationship had devolved into carefully managed interactions during family events, where I attempted to avoid triggering her competitive instincts while she searched for opportunities to reassert her superiority. The wedding humiliation was her masterpiece, a public demonstration that despite my professional achievements, I remained the awkward younger sister who could be destroyed at will. But what Rachel didn't understand was that medical training had taught me about recovery, resilience, and the difference between acute trauma and chronic dysfunction. The wedding might have been her victory, but it was also the moment I finally understood that our family dynamic was a disease that required surgical removal from my life. The morning after Rachel's wedding, I woke up in my childhood bedroom for the last time, surrounded by participation trophies and honor roll certificates that suddenly felt like evidence of a life spent seeking approval from people who would never provide it. The humiliation from the night before had crystallized into clarity. I needed to cut ties with family dynamics that were toxic to my mental health and professional development. I moved to Boston 3 weeks later, accepting a pediatric surgery fellowship at Children's Hospital that I'd been considering but had hesitated to pursue because of geographic distance from family. The distance was no longer a drawback, but the entire point. I needed physical space to heal from emotional wounds that had been accumulating for 28 years. The fellowship was brutal in ways that made medical school seem like casual preparation. 18-hour days, life and death decisions, the crushing responsibility of operating on children whose futures depended on precision I was still developing. But the intensity was also therapeutic. Pain that served a purpose, exhaustion that led to growth, pressure that forged competence rather than just breaking spirits. Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, my supervising surgeon, became the mentor I'd never had, someone who recognized my abilities and pushed me to exceed limitations I'd internalized during childhood. She was the first person to suggest that my careful observation skills and methodical approach weren't social deficits, but surgical strengths. "You see things other residents miss," she told me during one of our post-operative debriefings. "That hesitation you interpret as insecurity is actually careful assessment. Those are the instincts that save lives when everyone else is rushing toward the obvious solution." Under her guidance, I developed surgical skills that earned recognition from attending physicians who'd initially been skeptical about my potential. By my 3rd year, I was being invited to present cases at national conferences, and my research on pediatric cardiac procedures was being published in prestigious medical journals. The professional success was deeply satisfying, but the personal healing required different work. I started therapy with Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist who specialized in family trauma, and helped me understand the dynamics that had shaped my childhood experience. "Your sister exhibits classic narcissistic patterns," Dr. Chen explained during one of our sessions. "The need for constant admiration, the inability to empathize with others' pain, the way she consistently positioned you as inferior to maintain her own sense of superiority. That's not normal sibling rivalry. It's psychological abuse." Hearing the word abuse applied to my childhood was both validating and devastating. I'd spent years minimizing Rachel's behavior as sibling competition, rather than recognizing it as deliberate cruelty designed to maintain her position as the favored child. The therapy work helped me understand why I'd struggled with relationships throughout my 20s. I'd been programmed to accept treatment that healthy people would never tolerate. Learning to recognize my worth independently of family approval was essential for developing authentic connections with colleagues and friends. I met James during my 4th year of fellowship, another surgeon whose dedication to healing children had cost him significant personal relationships, but had also made him uniquely capable of understanding my priorities. Our courtship was slow and careful, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than the passionate dysfunction I'd mistaken for love in previous relationships. "Your family doesn't define you," James told me when I finally shared the story of Rachel's wedding behavior. "The people who matter can see who you really are based on your actions, not their projections." By the time I completed my fellowship, I'd established myself as one of the most promising pediatric cardiac surgeons in the region. I accepted a position at Boston Children's Hospital that came with research funding, teaching responsibilities, and the kind of professional recognition that made my childhood feelings of inadequacy seem like ancient history. I purchased a townhouse in Back Bay, decorated it with art I loved rather than possessions designed to impress others, and created a life that reflected my values rather than my family's expectations. The silence from home was initially painful, but gradually became peaceful, proof that I could thrive without their approval or attention. Family contact dwindled to holiday cards and brief updates shared through our parents, who seemed relieved not to manage the tension between their daughters. I learned about Rachel's life through social media posts that showcased her perfect marriage, beautiful home, and enviable lifestyle, all curated to suggest that banishing me had been the right choice for everyone involved. But I'd also learned about the difference between image and reality through my work with pediatric patients and their families. The parents who posted the most optimistic updates were often struggling with the deepest fears about their children's prognoses, while the families who seemed to have everything together were frequently falling apart behind closed doors. Rachel's perfect life felt performative in ways that reminded me of her childhood need to be the center of positive attention, but I was finally in a position where her performance anxiety didn't require my participation as the inferior comparison, and her happiness didn't depend on my misery. The 12 years between her wedding and yesterday's appearance at my door were the healthiest of my life. Successful career, meaningful relationships, personal growth that had transformed me from the broken child who'd cried at her sister's reception into a confident woman who saved children's lives for a living. When she knocked on my door with tears in her eyes, begging for help with her daughter's medical crisis, I almost didn't recognize the desperate woman as the same person who'd once laughed at my pain for entertainment. While I was building my medical career in Boston, Rachel was constructing an elaborate performance of domestic perfection that required constant maintenance and increasingly sophisticated lies to sustain. Her marriage to Marcus had been built on mutual social ambition rather than genuine compatibility, and the cracks were becoming impossible to hide despite her expertise at image management. Marcus Chen was everything our parents had hoped I'd find, but Rachel had secured instead: handsome, financially successful, from a respectable family that enhanced the Morrison social standing. He was also emotionally unavailable, controlling about money, and completely uninterested in the kind of authentic intimacy that might have made their marriage sustainable beyond its initial chemistry. Marriage is work, Rachel would tell her friends at charity luncheons, her voice carrying the practiced wisdom of someone who'd read every relationship self-help book while avoiding actual vulnerability with her spouse. People today expect too much romance and not enough commitment to building something lasting. But the work she referenced was primarily aesthetic, maintaining their beautiful home, hosting successful dinner parties, and ensuring that their relationship appeared enviable to the social circles that validated her sense of self-worth. The emotional labor required for genuine partnership was either ignored or delegated to marriage counselors who couldn't address problems that clients wouldn't acknowledge. Sophie's arrival 3 years into their marriage provided temporary distraction from the growing distance between Rachel and Marcus. The pregnancy was planned strategically. Rachel was 29, Marcus was 32, and their timeline for children aligned with career goals and social expectations about appropriate family development. "Sophie is absolutely perfect," Rachel would announce to anyone who would listen, sharing professionally photographed images of her daughter's milestones with the same precision she'd once applied to documenting her own achievements. "Everyone says she looks exactly like me, but with Marcus's eyes." The obsession with Sophie's appearance and development wasn't entirely superficial. Rachel genuinely loved her daughter but expressed that love through the same competitive framework that had shaped her relationship with me. Sophie needed to be the most beautiful, most advanced, most admired child in their social circle to reflect properly on Rachel's maternal competence. But Sophie proved to be a challenging child who didn't respond well to Rachel's attempts at behavioral micromanagement. She was shy like I had been, more interested in books than social interaction, and resistant to the performance expectations that had defined Rachel's own childhood experience. "Sophie's just going through a phase," Rachel would explain when her daughter hid behind furniture during play dates, or refused to participate in the music lessons and dance classes that were supposed to showcase her talents. "Some children take longer to develop confidence." The phrase was eerily similar to explanations our mother had offered about my childhood social struggles, but Rachel seemed unaware of the parallel or unwilling to consider that her parenting approach might be recreating patterns that had damaged our sibling relationship. Marcus's response to parenthood was to increase his work hours and social activities, leaving Rachel to manage most of Sophie's care while maintaining their demanding social calendar. The division of labor was traditional in ways that Rachel publicly celebrated but privately resented, especially as Sophie's needs became more complex and demanding. "Marcus is such a dedicated provider," Rachel would say, when friends asked about his absence from school events and family activities. "He works so hard to give us this wonderful life. I'm lucky to be able to focus on Sophie and our home." But the wonderful life was becoming financially unsustainable, as Marcus's business struggled with economic changes he'd been too proud to acknowledge. His consulting firm was losing clients to younger competitors who offered services at lower rates, and his solution was to spend more money on marketing and lifestyle maintenance, rather than adapting their business model. Rachel remained unaware of their financial problems until creditors began calling, and she discovered that Marcus had been using credit cards to fund their standard of living while hiding mounting debts from his wife. The perfect marriage was being held together by loans against their home equity and strategic manipulation of their credit limits. "We're just going through a temporary cash flow issue," Marcus explained, when Rachel finally confronted him about the financial statements she'd found hidden in his office. "The business is about to turn around, and we'll be back to normal within 6 months." But normal had been unsustainable even before their financial crisis, and the stress of hidden debt was accelerating the breakdown of a marriage that had never been built on solid emotional foundations. Marcus began working longer hours to avoid home tensions, while Rachel increased her social activities to maintain appearances despite growing anxiety about their future. Sophie, meanwhile, was developing symptoms that concerned her teachers: frequent illnesses, difficulty concentrating, and behavioral changes that suggested stress beyond normal childhood adjustment issues. Rachel attributed these problems to school pressures and Sophie's naturally sensitive personality, but medical consultations revealed more serious concerns. "We'd like to run some additional tests," Sophie's pediatrician explained, during what was supposed to be a routine checkup. Some of her symptoms could indicate underlying conditions that require monitoring and potential treatment. The medical testing began Rachel's education and healthcare costs that insurance companies classify as experimental or optional. Each specialist consultation required co-payments they couldn't afford, while diagnostic procedures accumulated bills that stretched their already strained finances past the breaking point. As Sophie's condition worsened and their financial situation became desperate, Rachel was forced to confront the possibility that her perfect life had been an elaborate construction that was collapsing under the weight of real-world pressures that couldn't be managed through social media posts and strategic image management. The sister she'd spent our childhood dominating had become a successful surgeon, while Rachel's own achievements were proving as fragile as the marriage and financial security she'd believed were permanent. But admitting that would require acknowledging that everything she'd built her identity around had been as superficial as I'd always suspected. During the 12 years of our estrangement, contact between Rachel and me was limited to carefully orchestrated family events, where our parents insisted on maintaining the fiction that their daughters could coexist peacefully if everyone just ignored the obvious tension. These occasions, Christmas dinners, milestone birthdays, and anniversary celebrations, became exercises in diplomatic avoidance rather than genuine family gatherings. I would fly home from Boston 3 or 4 times per year, staying in hotels rather than our childhood bedrooms to maintain psychological distance from family dynamics that could still trigger anxiety despite my therapeutic progress. The visits were brief, polite, and structured around activities that minimized opportunities for private conversation between Rachel and me. "It's so wonderful to have both my girls home," Mom would say during these gatherings, her voice carrying forced enthusiasm that fooled no one but herself. "I know you're both so busy with your important lives, but family time is precious." Rachel and I had perfected the art of interacting cordially while maintaining emotional walls that prevented either genuine connection or open conflict. We discussed safe topics, weather, travel, professional updates delivered in broad strokes, while carefully avoiding any reference to our history or feelings about each other. "Chloe's doing amazing things at the hospital," Rachel would say when relatives asked about my career, her tone suggesting both pride and distance. "Saving children's lives. Very noble work. I could never handle that kind of pressure." The comment was typical Rachel, ostensibly supportive, while subtly implying that my career choice was admirable, but unsuited for someone with her social intelligence and life balance. She was acknowledging my success while simultaneously positioning it as evidence of my continued inability to understand what really mattered in life. I learned about Rachel's major life events through our parents' updates and social media posts that painted increasingly elaborate pictures of domestic perfection. The house tours, vacation photos, and professional family portraits suggested a life of enviable stability and happiness that made my single career-focused existence seem narrow by comparison. "Rachel's doing so well," Mom would report during our phone calls. "The new house is gorgeous. Marcus's business is thriving, and Sophie is just the most precious little girl. They're thinking about having another baby soon." The updates always carried subtle implications about my own life choices. Successful, but incomplete. Professionally fulfilled, but personally lacking the traditional milestones that validated adult achievement in our family's value system. But my years of therapy had taught me to recognize these comparisons as reflections of my family's limitations, rather than accurate assessments of my life's value. I was genuinely happy with my career, my relationship with James, and the authentic friendships I'd built with people who shared my interests and values. My colleagues at Boston Children's Hospital had become my chosen family, people who understood the demands of medical practice and supported each other through the inevitable stress of working with critically ill children. We celebrated each other's successes, provided comfort during difficult cases, and created the kind of professional community that made our challenging work sustainable. "You seem so much happier now," James observed during one of our early conversations about my family background. "Like you've finally found your place in the world." He was right. The distance from my family's dysfunction had allowed me to discover who I actually was, rather than who they'd insisted I should be. The shy, awkward child they'd labeled as problematic had grown into a confident surgeon whose careful observation skills and methodical approach saved lives that might have been lost to more impulsive interventions. My research on pediatric cardiac procedures had earned recognition that extended far beyond Boston. I was invited to speak at international conferences, collaborate with surgeons in other countries, and publish findings that improved outcomes for children facing the same kinds of life-threatening conditions I treated daily. The professional recognition was deeply satisfying, but it also highlighted the contrast between my family's continued perception of me as somehow deficient and my colleagues' respect for my expertise and contributions to our field. Dr. Morrison's techniques have revolutionized our approach to certain cardiac defects, explained Dr. Martinez when introducing me at a conference in London. Her innovative thinking and meticulous surgical skills have made procedures possible that we once considered too risky to attempt. Hearing myself described as innovative and meticulous by someone whose opinion mattered professionally was therapeutic in ways that family validation could never have been. I'd learned to measure my worth through meaningful work rather than other people's approval. Meanwhile, social media provided glimpses into Rachel's life that suggested increasing focus on material acquisitions and lifestyle management. The posts about designer purchases, expensive vacations, and home renovation projects created an impression of prosperity that seemed designed to compensate for something missing rather than celebrate genuine happiness. But I'd also learned enough about social media psychology to understand that the people who posted most frequently about their perfect lives were often struggling with insecurities that required constant external validation. Rachel's digital presence felt performative in ways that reminded me of her childhood need to be the center of positive attention. The last family gathering before yesterday's crisis was our parents' 40th wedding anniversary, where Rachel and I managed to maintain civil conversation for several hours without addressing any substantive topics. She looked tired despite her expensive clothes and professional makeup, while I felt genuinely content with my life, despite arriving alone to yet another family celebration. Chloe's still single, I overheard Rachel telling a cousin during the anniversary party. So dedicated to her career. I admire that, but I can't imagine missing out on the joys of marriage and motherhood for professional achievement. The comment was vintage Rachel, acknowledging my success, while implying that it was compensation for personal failures rather than evidence of different priorities and values. But her words no longer had the power to wound me, because I'd learned to define success through my own experience rather than her judgments. When she appeared at my door yesterday with tears in her eyes, the composed woman who'd spent 12 years projecting superiority was replaced by someone desperate enough to ask for help from the sister she'd systematically diminished for our entire lives. The first crack in Rachel's carefully constructed facade appeared during Sophie's 6th birthday party, when her daughter collapsed during the elaborate princess-themed celebration that had taken weeks to plan and cost more than most families spent on vacations. One moment Sophie was laughing with her friends, the next she was unconscious on the manicured lawn, while paramedics worked to stabilize her vital signs. "It's probably just excitement," Rachel insisted, as the ambulance pulled away from their house, leaving behind 20 confused children and parents who'd witnessed their perfect family moment transform into medical crisis. "Sophie gets overwhelmed at big events. She'll be fine once she gets some rest." But Sophie wasn't fine. The emergency room tests revealed irregular heart rhythms that required immediate intervention, followed by weeks of diagnostic procedures that progressively eliminated benign explanations and pointed toward more serious possibilities. The daughter Rachel had showcased as perfect was facing medical challenges that no amount of social media management could resolve. "We're looking at a rare genetic condition," explained Dr. Williams, the pediatric cardiologist who'd become their primary specialist. "It's treatable, but the interventions are complex and expensive. Even with insurance, you're looking at substantial out-of-pocket costs for the procedures she'll need." The financial implications were devastating for a family already struggling with hidden debt. Marcus's business was failing despite his continued denials. Their credit cards were maxed out, and their home equity had been depleted through months of financing their lifestyle with borrowed money. "How much are we talking about?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the desperate hope that the answer might be manageable through additional credit or family loans. "The immediate surgery will cost approximately $200,000 after insurance adjustments," Dr. Williams explained. "Long-term treatment could require additional procedures, medications, and monitoring that will add significantly to those costs over time." The number hit Rachel like physical violence. $200,000 might as well have been $2 million given their current financial situation. They'd been using credit card advances to pay their mortgage, borrowing from Marcus's retirement account to cover basic living expenses, and avoiding creditors who were becoming increasingly aggressive about collecting past due amounts. "We'll figure it out," Rachel told Sophie after their meeting with Dr. Williams. her voice carrying false confidence that couldn't mask the panic building behind her composed exterior. "Mommy and Daddy will make sure you get everything you need to feel better." But figuring it out required confronting realities that Rachel had been avoiding through years of strategic denial. Their health insurance classified Sophie's condition as requiring experimental treatment that wasn't covered under standard policies. The medical financing options available carried interest rates that would bankrupt them within months. Marcus's response was to increase his work hours while researching business loans that might provide temporary solutions to their immediate crisis. But his company's financial problems made additional credit impossible to secure, and their personal debt load was already beyond sustainable limits. "Maybe we could ask your parents for help," Marcus suggested during one of their increasingly desperate financial planning sessions, "or take out a second mortgage on the house." But Rachel's parents were living on fixed retirement income that couldn't support major financial assistance, and their house was already mortgaged beyond its current market value. The wealth Rachel had projected during our childhood had been more aspirational than actual, and her parents' modest professor salaries hadn't accumulated the kind of generational wealth that could address Sophie's medical needs. The social facade became impossible to maintain as Sophie's condition required frequent hospital visits that conflicted with Rachel's carefully scheduled social obligations. The dinner parties stopped, the charity committee meetings were missed, and the social media posts became sporadic rather than daily celebrations of their perfect life. "Rachel's been going through a difficult time," her friends began saying when she stopped participating in their usual activities. "Sophie's been having some health issues, and Rachel's being very private about the details." The privacy was actually desperation masked as discretion. Rachel couldn't admit that her perfect daughter was seriously ill, because that would require acknowledging that some problems couldn't be solved through positive thinking and strategic image management. She couldn't discuss their financial crisis, because that would expose the fake prosperity she'd been projecting for years. Sophie's condition worsened despite the treatments they could afford, and Dr. Williams's recommendations became increasingly urgent about the need for surgical intervention that couldn't be delayed much longer without risking permanent damage to her heart. "We understand your financial concerns," Dr. Williams told them during their latest consultation. "But Sophie's window for optimal surgical outcomes is closing. If we wait much longer, the procedures become more complicated and less likely to provide complete resolution." The medical timeline was forcing decisions that Rachel and Marcus weren't financially prepared to make. They could continue delaying surgery while trying to secure funding, but that approach risked Sophie's long-term health and potentially her life. They could proceed with surgery and declare bankruptcy afterward, but that would destroy their remaining credit and social standing. "There might be one option," Marcus said quietly during their drive home from the hospital. "Someone in your family who might be able to help. Someone who's probably wealthy enough to handle this kind of expense without it destroying their life." The suggestion hung between them like a confession of defeat. Marcus was talking about me, the sister Rachel had humiliated, dismissed, and estranged for 12 years. The successful surgeon whose achievements Rachel had minimized was now the only person they knew with both the financial resources and medical knowledge to understand Sophie's situation. "I can't ask Chloe for help," Rachel said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Not after everything that's happened between us. She'd probably refuse just to get back at me for the wedding." But as Sophie's condition continued deteriorating and their options dwindled to nothing, Rachel was forced to confront the possibility that swallowing her pride might be the only way to save her daughter's life. The sister she'd spent our childhood dominating had become her only hope for preserving the family she'd built while destroying ours. The morning Rachel finally acknowledged that asking me for help was their only remaining option, she spent 3 hours sitting in her car outside Sophie's school, trying to summon courage for a conversation that would require admitting 12 years of cruelty had been motivated by jealousy rather than justified superiority. The woman who'd once laughed at my tears was about to beg for mercy from someone she'd given every reason to refuse. Sophie's latest medical episode had been the most severe yet. Emergency room visits were becoming weekly occurrences, and Dr. Williams had made it clear that delaying surgery beyond the next few weeks could result in permanent cardiac damage that would affect her quality of life forever. "We've exhausted all the standard treatment options," he'd explained during their most recent consultation. "Sophie needs surgical intervention now, not in 6 months when you might have better financial arrangements. Her heart is deteriorating faster than we'd hoped." The medical urgency was colliding with financial reality in ways that kept Rachel awake at night, calculating impossible mathematics where Sophie's life depended on money they didn't have and couldn't obtain through any conventional means. Marcus's business had officially failed, their house was in pre-foreclosure, and credit card companies were threatening legal action over unpaid balances. "I've contacted every charity organization that assists with pediatric medical expenses," Marcus reported after spending days researching assistance programs. "The waiting lists are months long, and most require proof that you've exhausted family resources before they'll consider your application." Family resources. The phrase felt like mockery given that their primary family resource was the sister Rachel had systematically alienated for our entire lives. I was the only person they knew with sufficient wealth to address Sophie's medical needs, and I was also the person with the most justification for refusing to help. "Maybe Chloe wouldn't hold grudges when it comes to a child's life," Marcus suggested, though his voice carried more hope than conviction. "She's a pediatric surgeon. She understands what Sophie is facing better than anyone. Her medical expertise might override personal feelings about family conflicts, but Rachel knew me well enough to understand that my professional compassion wouldn't automatically translate into personal forgiveness. I'd built my career around helping children whose parents couldn't afford the best medical care, but I'd also spent 12 years proving that I could thrive without my family's approval or support. The research Rachel conducted about my current life was both impressive and humiliating. Online searches revealed professional achievements that exceeded anything she'd accomplished. Published research, international speaking engagements, surgical innovations that had been featured in medical journals and mainstream media coverage. "Top 40 under 40 physicians in America," read one headline that made Rachel's stomach clench with recognition of how wrong she'd been about my potential. Dr. Chloe Morrison's groundbreaking work in pediatric cardiac surgery has revolutionized treatment options for children with complex heart defects. The articles about my success were accompanied by photographs showing a confident woman who bore little resemblance to the awkward girl Rachel remembered humiliating at her wedding. I looked accomplished, content, and completely removed from the family dynamics that had once defined my sense of self-worth. More painful than my professional success was evidence of my personal happiness. Social media posts showed a beautiful home, travel to exotic locations, and what appeared to be a serious relationship with a man whose own credentials suggested we were well-matched intellectually and professionally. "She's engaged," Rachel discovered, while scrolling through my Facebook feed, "to another surgeon. They look happy." The engagement photos showed James and me on a beach in Tuscany, both of us glowing with the kind of genuine joy that Rachel had tried to create through strategic image management, but had never actually experienced. We looked like people who'd found authentic love, rather than performed it for social approval. My success made Rachel's request more difficult, because it eliminated any possibility that I might need family reconciliation for my own emotional well-being. I'd built a complete life without them, while they were facing destruction that only I could prevent. "I don't even have her current phone number," Rachel admitted to Marcus as she prepared for the most humiliating conversation of her life. "I'll have to get it from Mom, and then explain why I suddenly need to contact the sister I've ignored for 12 years. The conversation with their mother was painful in ways Rachel hadn't anticipated. Learning that our parents had maintained minimal contact with me throughout our estrangement forced her to confront how thoroughly she'd succeeded in driving me away from the entire family, rather than just from her. "Chloe's number? Oh, honey, why do you need that?" Mom asked, her voice carrying curiosity mixed with hope that her daughters might finally reconcile. "Is everything all right? You haven't asked about your sister in years." "Sophie's having some medical issues," Rachel replied, unable to articulate the full scope of their crisis. I thought Chloe might have some professional advice about specialists or treatment options. The lie was easier than admitting that she needed to beg for financial assistance from someone she'd spent our childhood systematically destroying, but it was also preparation for the much more difficult conversation she'd need to have with me directly. "I'm so glad you're reaching out to her," Mom said, providing my contact information along with updates about my life that highlighted the success Rachel had been trying to ignore. "She's doing remarkably well. The hospital where she works just promoted her to department head, and her research is being funded by the National Institutes of Health." Each detail about my achievements was another weight added to Rachel's growing understanding of how completely she'd misjudged my potential, and how thoroughly she'd sabotaged our relationship for reasons that now seemed petty and self-destructive. The drive from their home in Connecticut to my house in Boston took 4 hours, during which Rachel rehearsed conversations that might convince me to save Sophie's life, despite having every reason to refuse. She'd practiced apologies that acknowledged her cruelty, explanations that detailed Sophie's medical needs, and pleas that focused on an innocent child who didn't deserve to suffer for her mother's failures. But she'd also prepared herself for rejection that would be justified by years of sisterly abuse. The woman she was about to face had succeeded without family support and had no obligation to provide assistance that would essentially reward Rachel's cruelty with generosity she didn't deserve. Standing on my doorstep yesterday, Rachel was confronting the possibility that Sophie's life depended on mercy from someone she'd never shown compassion. The golden child who'd once commanded automatic forgiveness was about to discover whether her rejected sister had developed the kind of character that could separate an innocent child's needs from their complicated family history. When I opened the door, Rachel saw immediately that the 12 years had transformed me into someone she no longer recognized, confident, successful, and completely unknown to the sister who'd thought she understood everything about my limitations and potential. "Chloe," she said, her voice breaking with emotion she couldn't control. "I need your help. Sophie is dying, and you're the only person who can save her." The woman standing on my doorstep bore little resemblance to the radiant bride who'd humiliated me 12 years earlier. Rachel's designer clothes had been replaced by wrinkled jeans and a cardigan that suggested she'd dressed for desperation rather than impression management. Her perfectly styled hair was unkempt, her makeup was smeared from crying, and her eyes held the kind of terror that parents experience when facing their child's mortality. "Chloe," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper, "please, I know I have no right to ask, but Sophie needs surgery that costs $200,000, and we don't have the money. The doctors say she'll die without it." I stared at my sister through the doorway that separated my peaceful life from the chaos she'd brought to my threshold. 12 years of therapy had prepared me for many scenarios, but not for the moment when my tormentor would arrive desperate enough to abandon all pride while begging for assistance. "Come inside," I said finally, stepping back to allow her entry into the home she'd never imagined I could afford. "We need to discuss this properly." Rachel moved through my foyer like someone entering a museum, her eyes taking in the artwork, hardwood floors, and architectural details that spoke of success she'd never acknowledged. The contrast between my obvious prosperity and her obvious desperation created visual evidence of how completely our circumstances had reversed. I led her to the living room where James and I had planned our wedding, where I'd celebrated professional achievements, where I'd built a life that had no connection to the family trauma she represented. The space felt contaminated by her presence, but Sophie's medical crisis demanded that I separate my feelings about Rachel from my concern for an innocent child. "Tell me about Sophie's condition," I said, settling into a chair across from where she perched nervously on my sofa. "What exactly is she facing?" Rachel's explanation was medically imprecise but emotionally devastating. Sophie had developed a rare cardiac condition that required immediate surgical intervention to prevent permanent damage. The procedures were complex, expensive, and time-sensitive in ways that didn't accommodate their financial planning difficulties. "Doctor, Williams says we have maybe 3 weeks before it's too late for optimal outcomes," Rachel said, tears streaming down her face as she described their daughter's deteriorating condition. "After that, the surgery becomes more dangerous and less likely to provide complete resolution." As a pediatric cardiac surgeon, I understood immediately what Sophie was facing, the same kinds of complex defects I treated regularly at Boston Children's Hospital. The procedures Rachel described were technically challenging, but routinely successful when performed by experienced surgical teams with proper equipment and support. "Have you gotten a second opinion?" I asked, shifting into professional mode, despite the personal complexity of our conversation. "Some conditions can be misdiagnosed, or may have alternative treatment approaches. 3 different specialists," Rachel replied. "They all agree that surgery is Sophie's only option for long-term survival. The cost estimates are consistent across all the consultations." I made notes about Sophie's condition while calculating the financial requirements for her treatment. $200,000 was significant, but not catastrophic for someone with my income and accumulated savings. The money itself wasn't the issue. The question was whether I could provide assistance to someone who'd caused me profound trauma while maintaining my own emotional stability. "Rachel," I said carefully, "I need to understand something before we discuss financial arrangements. Why are you coming to me for help? What about Marcus's family, your friends, the social network you've spent years cultivating?" The question hit her like physical violence, forcing acknowledgement that her perfect life had been constructed on foundations too shallow to support real crisis. When they'd needed genuine assistance rather than social validation, the people she'd invested decades in cultivating had proved as superficial as the relationships themselves. "Marcus's parents are elderly and live on fixed income," she said, her voice barely audible. "Our friends, they've been supportive emotionally, but no one has the kind of money Sophie needs. And I spent years burning bridges with people who might have helped because I thought success meant not needing anyone else." The admission was devastating to witness. Rachel was acknowledging that her entire approach to relationships had been transactional rather than authentic. focused on what people could provide for her social standing rather than genuine connection that could survive crisis. "And you think I should help you after everything that happened between us?" I asked, not cruelly but directly. "After you humiliated me at your wedding, dismissed my achievements, and spent our entire childhood making me feel worthless?" Rachel's face crumpled as she confronted the full scope of her cruelty and its potential consequences for Sophie's survival. She'd spent 12 years avoiding accountability for her behavior, and now that behavior was creating obstacles to saving her daughter's life. "I know I don't deserve your help," she said, sobs making her words barely comprehensible. "I know I was terrible to you, jealous and cruel in ways that can't be excused. But Sophie doesn't deserve to pay for my mistakes. She's innocent, and she's dying, and you're the only person who can save her." The plea was everything I'd imagined it might be: desperate, honest, and completely dependent on mercy she'd never shown me. But it was also about a child whose life hung in the balance, a little girl who'd inherited her mother's circumstances but not her choices. "I'll pay for Sophie's surgery," I said quietly, watching relief transform Rachel's features, before I continued with conditions that would redefine our relationship permanently. "But there are things we need to discuss first, about our family, about what happened between us, and about what Sophie's recovery will require going forward." Rachel nodded frantically, clearly willing to accept any terms that would secure her daughter's survival. But she had no idea that the conversation we were about to have would reveal secrets that would change everything she thought she knew about our family and the reasons behind my childhood failures. The money was the easy part. The truth would be much more expensive for both of us. After agreeing to fund Sophie's surgery, I led Rachel to my study, where patient files and medical journals created the professional environment I needed for the conversation that would redefine our understanding of our entire shared history. The room felt safer than my living room for discussing family secrets that had been buried for 30 years. "Before we arrange payment for Sophie's treatment," I said, settling behind my desk while Rachel sat across from me like a patient receiving a difficult diagnosis, "there's something you need to understand about our family that will change how you see everything that happened between us." Rachel's expression shifted from gratitude to apprehension as she processed my tone. This wasn't going to be a simple discussion about medical logistics or payment arrangements. I was preparing to share information that would be as devastating as any surgical procedure. "I need to show you something," I continued, pulling out a manila folder I'd kept locked in my desk for 20 years. "Documents that explain why I struggled in school, why I seemed so different from you, and why our parents treated us so differently throughout our childhood." The folder contained medical records, legal documents, and correspondence that told a story Rachel had never suspected. As I spread the papers across my desk, she leaned forward with growing confusion and mounting dread about what I was about to reveal. "These are adoption papers," I said, pointing to the first document. "I was adopted when I was 6 months old. I'm not your biological sister, Rachel. I'm not related to our parents by blood." The words hit the room like a physical force, creating silence so complete that I could hear Rachel's sharp intake of breath as she processed information that contradicted everything she'd believed about our family structure. "That's impossible," she whispered, staring at the adoption decree that bore our parents' signatures and my original birth certificate listing different names. "You're my sister. We grew up together. They never said anything about adoption. They kept it secret because I was the product of an affair," I continued, sharing the most painful part of the truth. "Your father had a relationship with another woman, and when she became pregnant, our mother agreed to raise me as their own child, rather than face the scandal of his infidelity being made public." Rachel's face went completely white as the implications sank in. I wasn't her sister, but her half-sister, the physical evidence of her father's betrayal of her mother. The family dynamics that had shaped our childhood suddenly made horrifying sense. I'd been a constant reminder of marital infidelity that everyone pretended hadn't happened. The learning disabilities, the social struggles, the way I never quite fit in with your family's expectations. All of it makes sense when you understand that I was a stranger's child being raised by people who resented my existence, I explained. They couldn't love me the way they loved you, because every time they looked at me, they were reminded of the affair that nearly destroyed their marriage. The medical records showed evidence of neglect that bordered on abuse, delayed treatment for obvious developmental issues, minimal intervention for educational struggles, and therapy recommendations that were ignored because addressing my problems would have required acknowledging my different needs and origins. "Your mother agreed to raise me, but she couldn't forgive my existence," I continued. "And your father was too guilty about his affair to defend the child he'd created outside their marriage. I was kept as a family member, but treated as an unwelcome burden." Rachel stared at the documents that explained 3 decades of family dysfunction, her face cycling through shock, horror, and growing understanding of how their family's secret had shaped every interaction between us. The favoritism wasn't just about personality differences, I said. It was about you being their legitimate child while I was evidence of betrayal that had to be managed rather than celebrated. They couldn't get rid of me without creating scandal, but they couldn't love me without confronting the circumstances that brought me into their lives. But why didn't they tell us? Rachel asked, her voice barely audible. Why did they let us grow up thinking we were biological sisters? Because admitting the truth would have required explaining the affair, addressing their marital problems, and acknowledging that they'd been lying about our family structure for our entire lives, I replied. It was easier to maintain the fiction and let me absorb the psychological damage of being the unwanted child. The revelation recontextualized everything about our childhood, my academic struggles, her easy success, the different expectations and treatments we'd received. Rachel had been raised as the cherished biological daughter, while I'd been the constant reminder of family trauma that everyone wanted to forget. Sophie isn't just your daughter, I said, delivering the final piece of information that would complete Rachel's understanding of our situation. If I'm paying for her surgery, I need you to understand that I'm essentially funding my half-sister's child's medical care. We're not just estranged sisters. We're connected by blood that neither of us knew existed. Rachel's tears came in waves as she processed the full scope of our family's deception and its impact on both our lives. I'd grown up feeling inherently flawed while she'd been taught to see me as inferior, when the reality was that we'd both been victims of their parents' inability to handle the consequences of marital infidelity honestly. I'm sorry, she whispered, though the words seemed inadequate for addressing 30 years of misdirected cruelty. I had no idea. They never gave any indication that we weren't. I thought your struggles were just personality differences. They wanted you to think that, I replied. It was easier to let you believe I was naturally inferior than to explain why they couldn't treat us equally. Your cruelty toward me was learned behavior. You were modeling the emotional distance and dismissal that our parents showed me daily. The conversation continued for hours, as Rachel grappled with the reality that our entire family history had been built on lies that protected our parents' reputations while destroying my sense of self-worth and warping her understanding of sibling relationships. But the truth also created new possibilities for our relationship. Understanding the source of our family dysfunction didn't excuse Rachel's cruelty, but it explained it in ways that made forgiveness possible, rather than just necessary for Sophie's medical care. 6 months after Sophie's successful surgery, I sat in the waiting room of Boston Children's Hospital while my niece underwent her final cardiac follow-up appointment. The same institutional surroundings where I saved other people's children had become the setting for healing my own family's deepest wounds, both medical and emotional. Rachel sat beside me, no longer the desperate woman who'd appeared at my door, but not yet the confident person she might become once our family finished processing 30 years of buried trauma. The surgery had saved Sophie's life, but rebuilding our relationship required work that was more complex than any medical procedure. Dr. Morrison? The nurse called my name, though today I was here as Sophie's aunt, rather than as a physician. Dr. Williams would like to speak with Sophie's family about her progress. The excellent news was exactly what we'd hoped. Sophie's heart function had improved dramatically. Her energy levels were normal for a child her age, and the long-term prognosis suggested she would live a completely normal life with minimal ongoing medical monitoring. Sophie is essentially cured, Dr. Williams explained as we reviewed her test results. The surgical correction was complete, and her heart has adapted beautifully to the repairs. She'll need annual checkups, but there's no reason to expect any limitations on her activities or life expectancy. Rachel's tears were relief rather than despair this time, the culmination of months of anxiety about whether the surgery would provide the complete resolution we'd hoped for. But she was also crying about the broader healing that had occurred as our family confronted truths that had been hidden for decades. The months following Sophie's surgery had been intensive family therapy for all of us. Rachel, Marcus, Sophie, and me working with Dr. Jennifer Walsh to address the psychological damage caused by our parents' deception and develop healthier relationship patterns going forward. The secrecy about Chloe's adoption created trauma for everyone involved, Dr. Walsh had explained during one of our sessions. The parents carried guilt and resentment that affected their parenting. Chloe internalized feelings of unworthiness, and Rachel learned to see her sister as fundamentally different, without understanding why. The therapy had been painful but transformative. Rachel was learning to understand how her childhood observations of our parents' emotional distance toward me had shaped her own behavior, while I was processing the relief of finally understanding that my struggles hadn't been evidence of personal inadequacy, but responses to impossible family dynamics. "I keep thinking about all the times I could have been kinder to you," Rachel said during one of our sessions. "All the opportunities I had to support you instead of competing with you. If I'd known what you were dealing with, if I'd understood why things were so hard for you." "You were a child too," Dr. Walsh reminded her. "Children learn relationship patterns from observing their parents. You weren't consciously choosing cruelty. You were unconsciously modeling the emotional patterns you witnessed at home." The understanding didn't excuse Rachel's behavior, but it provided context that made forgiveness possible, rather than just therapeutically recommended. She'd been shaped by the same family dysfunction that had damaged me, though her experience as the favored child had created different psychological wounds. Marcus had struggled with learning about our family's financial situation being resolved through my assistance, but he'd also committed to therapy, focused on his own issues with pride, control, and the business failures that had created their crisis. Their marriage was rebuilding on foundations of honesty rather than image management. "I want Sophie to know the truth about our family," Rachel said, as we left the hospital after her daughter's final appointment. "Not all the details, but the important things about love not depending on biology, about families being more complicated than they appear, about the importance of treating everyone with kindness regardless of their circumstances." The conversation about Sophie's medical bills had led to a broader discussion about how to use my financial resources to benefit our extended family without creating dependency or resentment. I'd established an education fund for Sophie and any future children Rachel might have, while also funding therapy for our aging parents as they confronted their role in creating our family's dysfunction. "I want to pay you back," Rachel had said repeatedly during the months following Sophie's surgery. "I know it might take years, but I want to repay the money you spent on Sophie's medical care." "The money isn't a loan," I'd replied. "It's what family members do for each other when someone is facing crisis. But if you want to honor the gift, invest in Sophie's emotional health and your own healing process." Our parents' reactions to learning that their family secret had been exposed were complex and difficult. Our father, now in his 70s, seemed relieved that the deception was finally over, but struggled with guilt about the affair and its impact on both his daughters. Our mother was more defensive, insisting that they'd done the best they could under difficult circumstances. "We thought protecting you from the truth about your parentage was the kindest approach," Mom said during one of our family therapy sessions. "We didn't want you to feel different or unwanted." "But I did feel different and unwanted," I replied. "The secrecy didn't protect me. It just prevented me from understanding why I was being treated differently. Truth would have been kinder than deception." The healing process was ongoing and imperfect, but it was genuine in ways that our previous family relationships had never been. Rachel and I were building a sisterly connection based on understanding rather than competition, while Sophie was growing up in a family that prioritized emotional honesty over social appearance. The most unexpected outcome was how my relationship with James had been strengthened by watching me navigate this family crisis with grace rather than revenge. He'd witnessed me choose healing over justified anger, compassion over retribution, and family restoration over self-protection. "You could have easily refused to help," he said one evening, as we discussed wedding plans that would include Rachel and Sophie in meaningful roles. "No one would have blamed you for letting them face the consequences of how they'd treated you." "Sophie didn't deserve to suffer for her mother's mistakes," I replied. "And Rachel didn't deserve to lose her daughter because of childhood dysfunction that neither of us understood at the time." The wedding humiliation that had ended our relationship 12 years earlier had been transformed into understanding that family healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. Rachel's desperate plea for help had become the catalyst for truth that freed both of us from patterns that had been damaging our capacity for authentic relationships. Standing outside the hospital where Sophie had been healed and our family had been rebuilt, I realized that the greatest surgery I'd ever performed hadn't been on a patient, but on the broken bonds between sisters who'd learned to love each other despite a childhood that had taught us we were enemies. The woman who'd once humiliated me for entertainment had become the sister who trusted me with her daughter's life, and I'd discovered that forgiveness could be stronger than justified resentment when it served a love that was bigger than our individual pain.